I come from a country, Lebanon used to be the only majority Christian country in the Middle East. Most people don't know that. When they think of the Middle East, they think it's all Islamic countries. But Lebanon is the only majority Christian country in the Middle East. We were open-minded, we were fair. We prided ourselves on our multiculturalism. We welcomed everyone to our country, especially from the surrounding Arabic countries, because we wanted to share with them the westernization which we had created in the heart of the Middle East. Muslims used to send their children to come study in our universities because we had built the best universities in the Middle East. They graduated and worked in our economy. Because we had built the best economy in the Middle East, even though we did not have any oil. Lebanon was known as Paris of the Middle East, the banking capital of the Middle East. And as Christians, we focused on education. Education was very important to us. You know, we educated girls and boys, you know, no difference. We were living the good time. Unfortunately, all that began to change by the 70s because of two things. The enlargement of the Islamic population in Lebanon, because we Christians marry one spouse until death do us part. We don't have many kids. Muslims, on the other hand, are allowed to marry up to 4 wives at a time. Now, of course, not all of them do it, but enough of them do it that in our country, in Lebanon, by the 70s, the Muslims became the majority. And once they became the majority, they started massacring the Christians and killing the Christians. I remember in 1974, we stopped traveling. We used to go spend Christmas and Easter in Beirut with the rest of my family. And we stopped traveling, and I would ask my father, why aren't we going to Beirut for Christmas this year? And my daddy would say to me, well, we just decided to stay home this year. And you know, I couldn't understand why. And later I learned is because Muslims started setting up fly-by-night checkpoints, and they would stop Christian cars traveling. And when they would get people out of the car and look at their ID and find out that this is a Christian family traveling, because in Lebanon, our religion is written on our national ID, on your driver's license, on your passport. So when they see that this is a Christian family traveling, they would get everyone out of the car and shoot them in cold blood. So we became prisoners to our homes and our cities and our communities. And that's the reason why we stopped going anywhere. By 1975, that's when the war broke out, the civil war. And the war broke out because Muslims walked into a church on a Sunday morning and began shooting at Christian worshipers, and injured hundreds and killed 4 people. And that's what started out the all-out war. And it was a very difficult time for the Christians, because as the Muslims organized and now supported by the oil money flowing out of Saudi Arabia and all the Muslim countries, they wanted to basically use Lebanon as a base from which to fight Israel, kill the Jews and drive them into the sea, using Lebanese democracy and Lebanese open-mindedness and tolerance to do exactly that. And that's really when my world turned upside down and it changed. Lebanon was so multi-faith and multicultural. So we had Druze, Muslims, Christians, Protestant. The majority were Christians. We were over almost 70% Christians when we got our independence in the 40s. But because of the way Muslims multiply, you know, with the multiple wives and multiple kids, in 30 years, they became the majority. And when we got our independence from France in Lebanon, because we are, you know, Judeo-Christians, you know, come from Judeo-Christian culture, we're very fair. So we made sure we divided the government to make sure that Muslims have representation. So the president of the country was Christian, the prime minister was a Muslim, the prime minister, you know, the secretary of state. We had different assignments for different religions. But the Muslims became the majority. And once they became the majority, they were no longer tolerant of the people who took them in and accepted them and included them in the country. They felt they were not a part of the country. They felt they were a part of the Islamic Ummah or the Islamic nation. So when they turned against their brethren Christians who lived in the same country, and Jews, but specifically the Christians, they began massacring us in large numbers because they thought we are in power now and therefore we set the rules on how things should be. And that's really what drove the country into war. We had the problem controlled when it was only the Christians in Lebanon and the Muslims in Lebanon. But what aggravated the situation was the influx of the Palestinians out of Jordan, who came to Lebanon. And Lebanon was the only country who took them in. Because we were the only country that accepted the third wave of Palestinian refugees, while the Muslim countries did not want them. And that's what really changed the situation. That's what tipped the scale. My life turned upside down in 1975. That's when my 9/11 happened to me. When radical Islamists bombed my home, bringing it down, burying me under the rubble, wounded as they shouted, Allahu Akbar. I ended up in a hospital for 2.5 months. And as I laid in a hospital bed, hooked up to IVs in both arms, going from one surgery to another, I would ask my parents, why did they do this to us? And my father would tell me, because we are Christians, the Muslims consider us infidels and they want to kill us. So I learned since I was a 10-year-old little girl that I am wanted dead simply because I was born into the Christian faith and lived in a Christian town. When we left, after 2.5 months, I left the hospital and came back home, but my home was no longer the home I left. I ended up living in a bomb shelter underground, without electricity, without water, and very little food. And to get some food, we would crawl out out of the bomb shelter under the bombs and dig out different dandelions and different vegetation that grew around our bomb shelter because it was the only greenery we had to eat. To get some water, we would crawl to a nearby spring to fetch some water. And because we were surrounded by Islamic snipers shooting at us, every time we left to go to the spring to get water, we would say our last goodbyes because we did not know if we're going to come back alive or dead, just to get a drink of water. And then when we would get to the spring, my mother had to use her stocking on top of the gallon of water to catch all the dirt and all the junk so we can drink the water. And this became my existence. And we heard those who fled, we were surrounded to be slaughtered by Islamic radicals, by the Muslim, our own neighbors who wanted to kill us. And we heard stories of those who were massacred in the rest of Lebanon, what the Muslims were doing to the Christians. The Muslims would surround Christian cities and trap the people inside. They would walk into bomb shelters. They would find a mother and a baby and a father hiding with a little baby in a bomb shelter. They would take the baby, tie one leg of the baby to the mother and another one to the father, and pull the parents apart, splitting the child in half. They committed monstrosities that were seldom reported in Western media. And then we heard what they were doing to the rest of the Christians. I mean, the monstrosities they committed, they would take Christians, for example, they would target Christian men, and not only they would slit a Christian man's throat, but then they will cut a cross on his chest. And then in many areas, sometimes they would crucify the men and put honey on their chests so they would be bitten by bees, stung by bees as they died. Most horrific crimes. I think the biggest disservice the American media did to the American public is not show the beheading of Daniel Pearl and Nick Berg. I think the American public needed to see the barbarism coming our way. And this is how we lived. And those Christians who fled the massacres and came to hide in our town because we were the last Christian enclave left in South Lebanon. And they would tell us these stories. And when these Christians were still there and the Muslims would come into their towns to do the massacres, and the Christians would tell them, you can't massacre us. We fought for your right. We marched with you. We demonstrated for you. You know, you can't kill us. We were on your side. And the Muslims would tell them, you were nothing more than a filthy infidel. You know, what difference are you from those other people? But it was too late for people to wake up, and those who escaped, by the time they get to our town, it was too late to change anything. This went on for 7 years. I ended up living in that bomb shelter for 7 years of my life, from the age of 10 till the age of 17, robbed of my youth.